All right, good morning, everybody. So it's just one of your student squadrons. You have all the space for activities if you want to spread out. No? You just like each other that much? Wonderful. All right, welcome to day 3, the cyber lesson. Where are the 17s in the room? Admit it. Okay, I was really timid. Maybe. Don't blame me. Yeah, right. Don't want to get called out for all of our IT issues. Got it. Today's lecture, Cyber Domain, Contemporary Emerging Warfare. Dr. Banzai, not the plant, the person. You'll be seeing him here in a second. He'll introduce the plant. Today, digging into cyber warfare, how it matters to you, how it matters to our adversaries, and what it might look like here in the near future. Please welcome back to the stage, Dr. Sipper.
Hey everybody, happy to be back with you today. So before we get started, let me introduce the tree. Now I was going to tell you right off the bat, I'm going to have Major Chris Tobier name all of my trees for me, because over the furlough, I had him taking care of my office tree for me, which is a smaller tree than this. It's a Chinese elm, really pretty little tree. And during that time, he decided to name the tree, and he named it Triance, which I thought was pretty good. But the other day I brought this one in, and I was walking down the hallway with it, and he said, "Ooh, she's hotter than Triance. That's Triana." So now, so he's going to have to continue to name, like we're going to have Cardi Tree, I don't know, Megan Tree Stallion, yeah. There's lots of options. So be thinking, I'm going back to Toby though. Toby's got it. He definitely is good at that. This is a special tree to me because I actually dug it out of my yard. I have a whole bank of nice Formosa azaleas in front of my garage. It had ground layered itself. That's when a tree branch hits the ground and then it forms its roots, and you just cut it off and then you stick it in a pot and you grow it. It's not that easy, but you get the point. But this thing, when I first got it, it was just a stick with a few roots on the end and a couple of leaves on the top. And I've been growing all these branches and stuff for the last 10 years to get it to this point. So if you think of a strategic hobby, it is bonsai. It's all bonsai, very strategic hobby. Also, digging up a tree from nature, that's kind of where bonsai started. In Japan, they would go out, they'd see these really cool trees, they would dig them up, they bring them home, put them in pots, train them, things like that. That's called yamadori, literally a mountain tree. But this is yardadori because I dug it up from my yard. So. But I hope you enjoy your moment of Zen today. Enjoy the tree as we're up here on stage. I bring one every week to have in class, and so I figured I'd bring one for all of you today and for the folks tomorrow as well. So really happy to be with you today and talk a little bit about cyberspace. Oh, by the way, this is what it looks like in the spring. So has these pink blooms all over. I spent 2 hours last night wiring all of the limbs and branches and turning all of the terminal buds up. So in the spring when it buds, it'll be layers of pink flowers all around the tree. So again, preparation, thinking ahead, strategic thought. So your lesson for the day. So, okay, all right. So what are we going to talk about today in cyberspace? And the way I wanted to break this down is to kind of keep it as operational level as possible and make it as usable for you in the classroom as possible, and also make it easier for your instructors to sort of focus on some of the activities in class. So this will hopefully front load some of that stuff for your instructors and for you to be able to do some discussion, to do some in-class activities, and have fun with it. So these are the different topic headings we're going to look at as we go through the talk today. So we'll start with how to fight in cyberspace. And I think the best place to start, and I'm going to put my glasses on for this, is to talk about the 3 components of a cyber attack. So the delivery mechanism, the exploit, which deals with the vulnerability that you're trying to exploit, and the payload. So the delivery mechanism, how is the attack carried out and how is it packaged? The exploit, what are you actually trying to get to happen? And then the payload, what do you want to actually, get into? What do you want to actually make an effect? What's the effect you want to have whenever you are executing this cyber attack? So first, the delivery mechanism, and there are several different, this is by no means an exhaustive list of delivery mechanisms, just a few to mention and to go through so that you can talk about them and maybe use them as you talk and have your conversations in class. There's, first off, the worm, and this, this cool 1980s breakdance, but also a really powerful tool that can be used in cyberspace for a delivery mechanism. The worms are self-propagating. They're very unlike, sometimes people say they'll use sort of a cover term like virus to describe all the things that are going on in a cyber attack. But they're all very different. A worm is very different from a virus in that it propagates itself. And I'll give you an example later on of a very famous worm that was used in Iran a couple of decades ago. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about that. Direct launch, that's when an adversary actually sends a cyber attack directly at whatever they're trying to attack, a machine, network, data, to actually exfiltrate data, things like that. User-directed launches, that is when you accidentally or on purpose click the link or open the file. Don't do that. It can cause lots of problems for you and your organization. You have to be very assiduous about whatever it is you're looking at in an email. If you're not sure, pass it on to your cybersecurity manager. Let's listen to Jeff and Tina, please, because it's important for you to understand that these are problems, that can actually be created by human beings. And the human layer of cyberspace is something we'll talk more directly about here soon as well. Cross-site scripting, that takes advantage of common infrastructure to inject additional code. So for instance, if you have a search bar or sometimes even your URL bar or drop-down menus or something where you can type information into, if you are a skilled adversary, you can use that to inject code and actually get it into a system or into a network and run scripts that way and do some very nefarious things within your network and within your systems. Malicious and compromised file, now that's a virus, and generally that's a file, and usually it has to be opened by you or someone else to be able to propagate. And it'll find its way through systems and infect other files, infect other systems, and do some bad things as well. Botnets are usually used for distributed denial of service attacks. So if you're trying to bring down a server, if you're trying to bring down a website, something of that sort, then you basically are going to go out, you're going to try to get control of as many processing capacity machines as you possibly can, either computers, servers, even Internet of Things devices like your internet connected refrigerator or Roomba or garage door opener at home. Anything that can send data through a network that they can use in a cumulative way in a botnet to send as a buffer overflow to another system and shut it down. And then finally, man-in-the-middle attacks. And these can be used in a couple of different ways by intercepting data and changing en route. So that's more of an integrity attack to put uncertainty into a system or into your communications, or a confidentiality attack where they get the data, they exfiltrate it, and they use it for an operation later on, or they just learn some intel value information that they capture from that. All right, so the next piece is your exploit or your vulnerability. And there are 5 basic types of exploits and vulnerabilities: software, hardware, configuration, policy, and usage. And of course, for software, that comes down to bugs or unpatched vulnerabilities in the software itself. So say, for instance, Microsoft releases a new version of Windows. In general, there will usually be some sort of exploit that's in there that they missed. And somebody is going to find that exploit, and they're going to leverage it somehow, somewhere. And that's happened every single time they've released something, every single time. There's also bugs. So those are just little problems in the software that can potentially present a vulnerability, something that you can use to exploit. 0 days are probably the worst kind, but there are also forever days. Forever days are exploits or bugs or unpatched vulnerabilities that will never be patched because the software provider who built them decided it was either A, too difficult to patch because they would have to change too many other things to do it, or B, it would cost too much. So they will just leave it unpatched forever. They do exist and they can be exploited under the right circumstances. So being aware that there are these things called forever days, not just 0 days and bugs, is an important piece of this as far as your exploits and vulnerabilities go. Hardware, backdoors, pure security design, anything where you can infiltrate the supply chain. For instance, what Israel did with pagers and radios a year or so ago. Significant cyber attack. It was actually combined supply chain, cyber, and EW attack, if you want to put it more plainly. Significant damage, death, destruction, maiming occurred as a result. So being able to get into a supply chain, put in backdoors to be able to leverage something like that, significant in cyberspace and in other domains of warfare as well. Configuration problems, these would be things like unsecured networks, directories, and files. So anywhere in a network or a network system where you have data, if you don't have all of your firewall rule sets, your proxies, your whitelists and blacklists configured properly, they can leave vulnerabilities open that can be exploited. So finding your way into the Air Force network, for instance, is possible through configuration problems that have not been fixed for one reason or another. And so that's why you have configuration management. When I was at 26 Network Operations Squadron here at Gunter for about 7 years, our configuration manager was a very important person. And their team was a very important team because they were the ones who were always looking for the configuration problems on the network and in the file systems, bringing that to our sysadmins and to our firewall team, to our router team, whoever needed to know, so that they could fix those problems and keep the network secure and keep it running. Policy, I actually wrote my dissertation on this. So back in 2012, I was over here at Maxwell by that time, over at the LeMay Center, and I went back over to 26 NOS and got 100 respondents and basically just got data from them about how to keep up with policy changes as technology grows so rapidly. And of course, we found that it was extraordinarily important to them to be able to do that, because if you don't keep up with the policy changes, you can have vulnerabilities pop up very, very rapidly because you're not securing things in the way you should from a policy standpoint. So policy, again, very, very important. If you're not implementing your zero trust network architecture, which is the way a lot of organizations are going now, which basically the idea of zero trust is you start with a group of people, you don't trust any of them on your network. You have to take them and build them up one by one with the permissions you want them to have so that they have different levels of trust on your network. So any new person that comes on your network, no trust, zero trust. And you build them up from there depending on whether they belong there or what they need to do in your network. Some say it's just an old a new implementation of the old mandatory access control and discretionary access control and things like that. Very close to that. And finally, usage. And this is the probably 90% of the time at least biggest problem on anything cyberspace. Again, it's humans. It's us. We click the link, we open the PDF, we navigate to the wrong URL, whatever it is, we introduce the problem onto the network or into the software or into our organization in some other way. And that's one of the reasons that education and training for cyberspace and everything that we do in cyberspace, which is enormous, is extraordinarily important and something I want to stress to you today as we go through this. So that sort of constitutes your exploits. So we talked about the delivery mechanism. Now we talked about some of the exploits and vulnerabilities. So let's look at the payloads. Now you'll notice that worm is on this list as well. And there's a good reason for that. It's because a worm can be both a delivery mechanism and a payload. So for instance, if you put a worm in, if you have a worm that is out there and you told it navigate to this place and infect it, and then when you get inside, you also infect it in these specific ways, that worm is running on an algorithm. It's sort of a type of early AI, and now it's become a lot more sophisticated today, that can run itself through systems autonomously. And this has become a big problem. You may have heard recently of Anthropic. They had an 80% AI tool that actually went out and infected systems. It's become a bigger problem. And as even kitty hackers and people who are VEOs and TCOs, these people in these organizations can get a hold of these algorithms, can design them themselves in some cases, or even use LLMs to build them, and then use them against tight systems, of levels of actual world-class network builders, like the US, like Russia, like China, so on and so forth, like Great Britain. So a real problem that can happen. But that's, again, a self-propagating thing that can be both a delivery mechanism and a payload. A Trojan, of course, is sort of the concept of the old Trojan horse, that you hear about in the Iliad, and basically it looks like something good, like, hey, download this package to protect your computer. It's an antivirus and it's free and it's great. And you download it, and of course it's just a Trojan. It's packed with a bunch of malware that unleashes itself on your computer. And that can do a lot of different things. One thing it can do, it can turn your computer into a bot that can be used in a botnet, like we talked about a moment ago. Other things it can do, it can put ransomware on your computer, which will basically encrypt all your files, and you have to pay a couple of $1,000s to get all your data back. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth about how that can happen, from a ransomware standpoint here in a moment. Some examples of that. Then you have backdoors, trapdoors. That's, again, more of a supply chain type of attack, where you have put something into the hardware that makes it easy for someone to get into that hardware and then get into your network, into your system, into your data, and do all kinds of terrible things from an integrity or confidentiality and accessibility standpoint. The distributed denial of service, I talked about that just a moment ago. The idea of you're sending a buffer overflow using tons and tons of data, so that a machine or a network or a website or whatever it may be cannot handle the load, the traffic load, and then shuts down and is completely blocked off. It's almost tantamount to jamming in cyberspace. You're sending so much noise at a system that it cannot function. It can't receive what it's supposed to receive, so it can't operate. So and we're going to talk about some more of these corollaries between electromagnetic spectrum operations and cyberspace operations today, because there are so many similarities, so many different levels between those two domains, if you will. Viruses, again, we talked a bit about viruses a moment ago, malicious software, loggers, and those are important because, say for instance, you have a logger on someone's computer and it's able to log everything you type. So all your passwords, all your usernames, lots of different types of data, of course, that you're going to be typing on a keyboard. It'll log that information. It can also log information from files. It can log interactions with other people, log emails. So loggers, very powerful tool. Intelligence gathering tool for an adversary to take and gather and use that information against you later on. And then finally, exfiltration mechanisms. And again, this would be exfiltrating large amounts of data. And here are a few examples of some of these things. I wanted to kind of give you some real world examples of things that have used these delivery mechanisms, exploits, and payloads in the past. So first off, you look at Stuxnet, and this was the one I was talking about obviously a while ago, was a worm that was delivered to the Natanz facility, nuclear facility in Iran. And interesting thing about the delivery mechanism on this, it wasn't just a worm, it was a human delivered delivery mechanism as well. About 2 weeks after the attack went off, a Dutch citizen died in a motorcycle accident in UAE. He was the person who actually put the worm on the network. He had been leveraged by some other people who were, using this, I can't say who, still, to be able to get into that facility because he already worked there, and to plug in a thumb drive into their system, and thus release this worm, which propagated itself throughout the nuclear network, attacking the Siemens PLC-6 drivers that are programmable logic circuits, which drove told the centrifuges how fast to go. And it was under-rotating or over-rotating, in some cases destroying the centrifuges, wreaked havoc throughout their nuclear program there at Natanz. Big, huge problem for Iran at the time. So I know a lot of you are familiar with that. As far as the exploit is concerned, it was all 5. It included software, hardware, configuration policy, and usage. Every single level was attacked from an exploit perspective. And the payload, of course, was a worm, but it also exploited backdoor, logger, and exfil, because what happened with that worm is somebody else, they weren't real big apparently on cybersecurity there. They didn't listen to Jeff and Tina, because somebody else apparently plugged in another thumb drive later on to get data off of the system, to get home, plugged it into their computer, and guess what? Stuxnet got out in the wild. It was picked up first by Mandiant, and they started analyzing the code, and then of course, after they figured out what it was and started telling the world about it, Iran was like, oh crap, So they started pulling it out, reverse engineering it, and it's blown up into its own monster. So it's like this Hydra that developed from this whole thing. So it went from a worm to a Hydra. All right, so then SolarWinds. Y'all may be familiar with SolarWinds. This was a Russian operation. SolarWinds itself is basically a dashboard tool that a lot of cybersecurity folks use to monitor network activity, traffic, security, all these different things. It's used across government, across corporations, across the military, worldwide, but especially in the United States, very, very prevalent. So Russia basically infiltrated the supply chain, put backdoors in the software and hardware of this dashboard tool, and they exfiltrated terabytes of data over a long period of time from that tool. Some of it encrypted, some of it not. What are they going to use it for? We don't know yet, but trust me, they know how to use it, and they will use it to their advantage if they can, which they can. The exploit was a software, hardware, and configuration problem. Configuration because apparently they weren't paying very good attention to their configuration management, or else they would have patched this a long time ago. They would have fixed it. They would have recognized it. That's a problem. You have to pay attention to your configuration management on your networks and in your tools and in your data. And then finally, Colonial Pipeline, and we're all very familiar with this. I think I may have mentioned this in my lecture for MT, but I actually physically myself saw people filling up Walmart plastic bags with gas because they were afraid that they were going to run out of gas because of this particular attack. And I mean, it's crazy, but people were freaking out. So it wasn't just like a cyber attack; it was also a psychological attack on us, especially in the eastern United States, which is where Colonial Pipeline runs. It was user directed. Again, don't click the link. Someone who had access to the financial systems of Colonial Pipeline downloaded a file. It got into the system, implanted ransomware. The ransomware took down all of the data, encrypted all the data for their financial systems. The reason they stopped pumping oil wasn't because they couldn't pump oil, it's because they couldn't figure out how much they were going to get paid for the oil. So they said, we're not going to pump oil again until we pay the ransom and we can get our data back online and we can figure out how much to pay, how much we're supposed to get paid. So they found the weakness. It isn't always in the critical infrastructure system. It isn't always in your programmable logic circuits or your remote terminal units or even in your computers and servers that control all of those things. It's sometimes another system that's tied to it that will cause you to stop operations, to suspend operations. And there are others. There's tons of these attacks that happen just every week. There's at least one in the world ransomware attack on some sort of health connected facility, a hospital system, a nursing home, because many of them don't use up-to-date software systems, very vulnerable. They get their data encrypted and they wind up paying the ransom one way or another. What most of these systems are doing today is they're buying ransomware insurance, which you think, oh, that's kind of cool, that's kind of good, except all the ransomware purveyors who actually attack these organizations know exactly how much the ransomware insurance pays. And so they just ask for that, they get paid, and the cycle continues. The cycle continues. Very, very problematic, as you might well imagine. But the exploit they were using was a configuration policy and usage issue. Usage, obviously, clicking the link, but also the way the network was configured, the policy being used, not done well, not up to date for that financial system. The payload was a Trojan, which installed ransomware, which caused the encryption of the data, and so on and so forth. Side note on that, the FBI did later trace down the Bitcoin, and they were able to steal it back from the dark side hackers, Russian hackers who did the activity and the ransomware in the first place, and remove their presence from the dark web. So, yay FBI. That was a good deterrent action, I guess you would say, for any future ransomware from that particular Russian hacking criminal gang. One more thing I'll mention before we move on, Volt Typhoon. Many of you may be familiar with Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, and Silk Typhoon. There's some new ones called Linen Typhoon and Lavender Typhoon, I think, that are from China. They're all Chinese. Volt Typhoon is especially a difficult one because it goes after many of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors that we have here in the U.S. So think electrical grid, water, sewage treatment, transportation, communications, all those things, medical care, all those different critical infrastructure assets that we depend on every single day. And they have, in many instances, been able to infiltrate those different critical infrastructure systems. And we've been spending the last several years just trying our best to weed them out of there, which is extremely difficult, as you might imagine. If they got in there to begin with, they're going to find their way back in almost immediately. So you're dealing with some very well-versed nation-state level hackers who know how to get into important systems like critical infrastructure, like Colonial Pipeline, like dams that control electricity, like electrical grids. And this is a big concern if you think about, for instance, if we did have operations that went off in the Pacific at some point, and just imagine this, you as a military member are over there fighting the fight, and in the small moments you have contact with your family, your children, your friends back home in the U.S., they're telling you all these terrible things like, we don't have electricity, we don't have access to clean water, we don't have access to medical care because of ransomware, we don't have access to whatever it is, fuel, because they've shut down the pipelines. That's the kind of interruptions that a nation state actor like China could actually do to disrupt not only what's going on in the AOR, but back home, and levy extra stress on you, on your families, and create economic situations that are untenable as well. So it's just a way, I'm not saying that's absolutely going to happen, but those are possibilities and things that we have to consider when we're talking about actions in cyberspace and some of the things that our adversaries can do to us. All right, so a couple of things about where we fight in cyberspace. So now that we've kind of talked about how we fight in cyberspace, and it's important to kind of go all the way back down to, okay, what do we mean where when we talk about cyberspace? Because there is key terrain in cyberspace that we need to be aware of. And I just kind of have green highlighted a few of the important pieces up here, and I have some references down here at the bottom as well for the pictures on the right and some of the stuff that's highlighted here. But key terrain in cyberspace is, if you look at it from a mission relevant terrain cyber, MRT cyber, is the entire set of cyber assets, processes, services, functions, infrastructure, and personas. And I'm going to talk about those individually here in just a moment. Mission essential tasks and mission essential functions and task critical assets. So those are the things you would focus on in key terrain in cyberspace, are those. Now, there's also key terrain cyber. Key terrain cyber is more. It's not less, it's more. It includes that subset of MRTC plus elements of adversary cyberspace that comprise specific assets, systems, services, infrastructure, personas identified as key terrain. So the same kind of things as before, as up above, including adversary cyberspace. And it can give us a marked advantage in adversary cyberspace if we know how to access it, to keep that access, and to maneuver in it. And cyberspace maneuver is something else I want to hit on here in the next couple of slides as well. So if we're looking at key terrain cyber, and we're looking at it broken down from those different categories I mentioned in the last slide, and we compare it to the layers of cyberspace. Now, when I gave the MT lecture, hopefully you remember some of it, from last semester, I talked about the different layers of cyberspace. And I proposed a fourth layer that's not in doctrine yet, but I think is probably going to be coming before too long. And the three layers that are in doctrine right now, of course, are the physical layer, the logical layer, and the cyber persona layer. I propose that we are already seeing an agentic layer. Just look at some of the AI bots, the AI agents that have been unleashed across the world that are wreaking havoc in tons of networks and systems and data stores right now. And that's not stopping. It's only going to get worse. Trust me, it's only going to get worse. But if you look at it from that asset system, services, processes, infrastructure, and personas perspective, just assigning or spreading out the maneuver layers in key terrain cyber across these different layers of cyberspace, including the agentic layer, assets are involved with all of them: physical, logical, human, and agentic. So when I say assets, I'm talking about like stuff, right? I'm talking about your computers, your servers, even your fiber lines in some cases, although that's probably falls a little bit more under infrastructure. But anything that is a device or stuff, your cell phones, your tablets, all that stuff, assets. Systems, that's generally physical because all of those assets are grouped into physical systems that you could operate across. Services, all four, because you're dealing with services across all of those systems, and they all include different aspects of physical, logical, human, and agentic layers of cyberspace. Processes, again, all four. Infrastructure, physical. And when I talk about infrastructure, there's a couple of different things that come to mind. One, of course, is the subsea cables that basically are carpeting the floors of the oceans across the earth. That's where 99, here it said, at least 99% of all communication across the surface of the globe goes through those subsea cables. And that's how we communicate with folks in Europe, Africa, everywhere that we communicate is through those lines. Now, growing in space are huge satellite constellations. In fact, Coyote Smith was telling me that Elon Musk recently said that they're going to build over the next 10 years or so 1,000 of the starships that they've been testing and have finally kind of gotten right, and plan to launch somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40,000 satellites into space over the next 10 years. Think about that, what that can provide from a bandwidth perspective to communicate over the horizon and maybe offer even, take us from 90% to maybe 95% or from 99% to 95% or 90% or whatever. In other words, it's shifting. We're beginning to see a huge push to start communicating through space rather than subsea cables in some instances, or at least to have another way to do that kind of communication, some sort of fallback, some sort of redundancy, which I think is important from an EMS perspective and a cyberspace perspective, and of course a space perspective, sort of the triumvirate of communications and technology that we have going on today. And then finally, personas, and again, human and agentic, because if you haven't noticed already, and I'm sure you have, it's difficult to tell the difference between an agent and a human many times. And that's not just in speaking to them, like if you're talking to a large language model, a GPT, Grok, whatever it may be, but also the way they write code, the way they draw pictures, the way they quote unquote take photographs. Very difficult to tell the difference. So that human agentic layer or human and agentic layer personas are becoming more and more fraught in cyberspace, and something to pay very close attention to. So again, to talk a little bit about cyberspace maneuver, I talked some about this in the MT lecture last semester, but I want to reinforce this because I think it's an important topic of discussion when you're talking about cyberspace operations. Because yeah, we're so used to understanding how maneuver happens in physical domains. I mean, on the ground and on the ocean, it's fairly two-dimensional. There is some elevation that can happen on land if you're going up a mountain or something like that. But for the most part, you're talking about range and azimuth. You're moving around this way. In the air, range, azimuth, and elevation. In space, range, azimuth, elevation, orbit, orbital mechanics, all the things that go along with the motions that you do in space. So over the years, over the centuries, we've gotten more and more complex in the way we maneuver in different domains of warfare. And then you throw in cyberspace and the electromagnetic spectrum, and it just all goes to hell because you've got all these levels to these domains that you have to concern yourself with. It's not just about range, azimuth, and elevation anymore. There's also if you're navigating at the logical layer versus the physical layer, or at the human layer versus the agentic layer. They're all different maneuver-wise in some way or other. And understanding that, first off, is where you have to start before you ever get into how do you actually maneuver in those places. And this is a proposed, very quick and easy way to look at it. It's a lot more complicated than this. I can only do so much on one slide. But if you're looking at it from a physical perspective, maneuver is going to deal with your devices, with your geography, and it's going to deal with your C locks, not C locks, but letter C locks, your cyber lines of communication, infrastructure. So think critical infrastructure, information infrastructure, Internet of Things, military Internet of Things, industrial Internet of Things, anything where you have a device and it's in a place, physical maneuver, physical considerations. Also in the electromagnetic spectrum, it deals with physical places for certain things and in certain parts of the air or in space. You're actually physically maneuvering things in space, which relates directly to cyberspace as well. Something that I'll note right here is that the electromagnetic spectrum is also logical, cognitive, and agentic. It contains all of the, or very, very similar layers as cyberspace does. So from a maneuver perspective, you can apply many of the same rules. I just want you to be aware of that, because when you're talking about cyberspace and the electromagnetic spectrum, those two suckers are conjoined. You cannot strip them apart. They have to have each other to operate. And a very important note. Logical, so that's where you're talking about data, IP addresses, routes, packets, ports and protocols, anything that isn't in a particular physical space in a system or on the earth. And logical maneuver is going to be different, very different than physical maneuver. So understanding, at least from the outset, that that's true is important. How exactly that's done is another matter, because that gets into code. It gets into how we are actually mapping systems and with IP addresses, and how we're using subnets and all kinds of other stuff that I just don't have time to explain today, and you don't really need to know for your own purposes. The human, of course, you're looking at things like pattern of life, psychology, deception, manipulation, anything that can be tied to the human psyche and human patterns and human way of doing things in cyberspace. And you may remember, how last semester I said, hold up all your devices and now throw them at the floor. Nobody did it because, we're tied to the data in these things. We are dependent on them in so many ways, not just from a personal standpoint, but from a warfare standpoint. We operate all of the things we do in the physical domains off of the data that we use from cyberspace and the access to that data through the electromagnetic spectrum. Significant paradigm shift that has occurred, not quite as rapidly as we thought it would. And finally, agentic. And so now we're seeing these autonomous algorithms and autonomous agents that are beginning to spread across the landscape of cyberspace. And I see the day coming when these things begin to reproduce, to propagate themselves. There's already plenty of code that writes code out there. In fact, even just your most basic LLMs, GPT, Grok, Claude, all of those are perfectly capable of writing code. You have to ask them to, generally, but that's code that writes code. In a way, that's a type of cyber reproduction. I won't take that too far, but you get the idea. If you have something that's autonomous and it autonomously creates other code, how far can that go? I don't know. An interesting thing to think about. But the fact of the matter is, right now, we are seeing an agentic layer arising among the other layers of cyberspace, and it's something we need to pay attention to, something we need to be very serious about, and something that we need to protect against insofar as we possibly can. All right, so a little bit more. I put this back up. This is a reinforcement slide from the military theory course when I briefed that last semester, lectured on that last semester. Basically just kind of reinforcing the idea that, yes, in cyberspace, we are using all of the same joint warfighting functions that all the other domains use. it's important to kind of think through that. It may be something that you do in class. You know, an instructor might say, okay, how do you use cyberspace, or how is cyberspace applied across the 7 joint warfare functions? Think about that. I won't go into any great detail here, but when you're thinking about it, you can't just think about it from one perspective, though. Again, you have to apply the different layers of cyberspace, and the maneuver, say movement and maneuver, for instance, in cyberspace is going to apply against different layers of cyberspace. Intelligence is going to apply across different layers of cyberspace, and so on and so forth. So thinking kind of more deeply about cyberspace and how the doctrine and the different things we think about conceptually apply to it, important part of this. All right, so this is just a little short kind of snippet on who we fight in cyberspace. I think you're all pretty aware. One item of interest that you might appreciate here, this chart right here is AI generated. I asked ChatGPT to generate this for me. Now, of note, the reason I put this up here and the reason I tell you that is because what I did is some prompt engineering, right? Whenever you're using AI, be careful with your prompt engineering. And I tell you that because it's real easy. If you were to just go out to ChatGPT and say, give me a table with group name words and all these things for these countries, and it just skim the surface web, it's liable to give you a whole bunch of garbage. But if you tell it, go to the MITRE website, or go to the Mandiant website, or go to the CrowdStrike website, a known good quantity with known good data, and give me that same data, it's going to give you something good. And it's even going to color it red like this to show that it's bad. Because it did. All I did is copied and paste this sucker right out of ChatGPT and stuck it on the slide. Because I was like, hey, that's good. I mean, of course, having some cyber knowledge myself, I knew it was right when it popped up. But just seeing that, you know, and knowing that if you're doing good prompt engineering, going to known good sources to gather your data and putting it up there, it helps a lot. This just gives you an idea of, okay, how are these different adversaries doing things in cyberspace against us? How are they leveraging cyber weapons and so on and so forth? Of course, we talked already about Volt Typhoon and what China is doing with that. Russia, a lot of things on critical infrastructure as well. Their internal organizations like the GRU, FSB, IRA, but also they leverage a lot of criminal hackers and even violent extremist organizations to do their hacking for them because they want to cause as much chaos as they possibly can to their adversaries. North Korea, big into ransomware, also big into using ransomware in another way called wiperware, where essentially they'll encrypt all your data and throw away the encryption key so that you can never unencrypt it, you can never decrypt it. That happened to Maersk, big, you know, shipping firm, where everybody's seen it. You see it on trains, you see it on boats. These big shipping containers, Maersk, cost them billions of dollars to reconstitute all their data because they didn't say, hey, pay us and we'll give you your data back. They just said, we threw away the encryption key. You can never have your data back. So they reconstituted all themselves. Cost them a lot of money and a lot of time. So yeah, Iran, asymmetric warfare using cyberspace, and of course their capabilities are getting better and better, partly because of Stuxnet. Because once they saw that sucker, they were like, we got to get better in cyberspace, and they started doing a lot of reverse engineering of that in particular, but also developing their own cyberspace capabilities. And of course, your violent extremist organizations, transnational criminal organizations getting into the game. And I think that's where it really starts to get dangerous because so many of them are really just watch the world burn kind of organizations that want to wreak havoc. And if they get a hold of this agentic layer of cyberspace and really start leveraging it, which is entirely possible, entirely probable even, we can be in some real trouble chasing that tail around all the time. All right. A little bit more about from a Blue Ops perspective of who we fight in cyberspace. So what kind of operations are we doing there? And I use the soccer pitch again, like I used last semester. It really comes down to persistent engagement, you know, staying in the knife fight and defending forward. So staying active in our allies and partners networks to help them get better and also to gather better intelligence, and active in our adversaries network, gathering intelligence to be able to build new cyber weaponry, to be able to build new cyber defenses against their own cyber weaponry. So intel gathering, staying in the knife fight, defending forward, intelligence gathering, offensive cyberspace operations, defensive cyberspace operations, all a big part of how we're fighting. And it's a lot like this fighting on a soccer pitch. You're always doing offense and defense at the same time. It's just a constant, persistent engagement, always moving, always going, all the time. And of course, from a TTP perspective, so what are our tactics, techniques, and procedures in cyberspace? And what I basically tell people is, if you, as a layperson, have thought about like the craziest thing you could do in cyberspace, it's already been done. Somebody's already thought of it, somebody had already designed the weapon, and they have it ready to go. Be creative. Think about it. It already exists. If you've thought about it, it exists already. All right, what do we protect? Of course, our homeland, our networks, critical infrastructure, key resources. And when I say key resources, I mentioned this in Flight 19 the other day. I said, you know, when it comes down to it, when you talk about resources, everything comes down to either agriculture or mining. Everything. You know, the fuel we use, the stuff that we, you know, the metal from the ground, the food we eat, the medicines that we have, all these different things, everything we use, everything we wear, everything we do, it comes down to those two things. So key resources that can be attacked by adversaries, extraordinarily important, something we have to guard against. Also, our information, and most importantly, our citizens. And our citizens, we and all of our loved ones, depend on all of the things that I just mentioned. Again, you know, the idea of being in a land far away, fighting a good fight, and knowing that your homeland can still be under threat. That's a big deal. And it's something that for centuries, really, the last couple hundred years, we haven't quite felt as much fear about it until 9/11. You know, there have been some events where we've had a little bit of that fear, but it's a growing fear, and it's a growing reality that we have to pay attention to and be aware of, that our homeland is at risk, especially in that particular domain of warfare. So military operations, and I mentioned a little while ago, military Internet of Things. You're all familiar with the Internet of Things, say in your house or even at work, all the different things that can be on the network. And I mentioned, you know, your Roomba, your garage door opener, your refrigerator, the lights in your house, whatever they may be. They're all today, even your car, they're Internet of Things devices. They're connected to the internet. They're interconnected, and they can be used against us. Well, in the military, we use the same kind of stuff. Interconnected devices, vehicles, any number of things, drones, whatever. It's all interconnected in network meshes that can potentially be vulnerable. We have to be aware of that. And that's from an operational technology and a platform technology perspective. Operational technology, you can think of maybe an aircraft carrier. Lots of operational technology on an aircraft carrier. Pumping, air conditioning, heating, any number of other operational technology type stuff that could be affected by a cyber attack, and has been shown to be vulnerable to cyber attacks, by the way. But on land, you know, same things in a factory or in a building like this. We have lots of operational technology, and it's connected to cyberspace in some way and operates off of cyberspace and through cyberspace in some way. And then platform technology, think of planes, you know, F-35. That thing's a flying computer. Millions of lines of code run that thing, and it could potentially be vulnerable. We already know ADSB is vulnerable across many of the flying things we have. So just being aware of that and understanding that. And then allies and partners, of course, we want to continue to persistently engage and defend forward in their networks, help them develop better, safer networks. The subsea cables that connect us to them and them to us and them to everybody else in the world, those things are vulnerable. You've probably seen news reports, read news reports over the last couple of years of subsea cables being severed. And of course, people, they'll get severed and Russia will go, oh, what isn't us? Guess what? It more than likely was, especially where they were dragging to actually do the severing. and the information infrastructure, and that includes everything from fiber lines to space, the satellites that are orbiting the Earth. All right, when to act, and I divide this up into proactively, reactively, and persistently. Proactively, you are trying to harden networks, trying to make sure that they are as invulnerable as possible. So having your firewall rule sets in order, implementing zero trust network architecture, all the things security-wise that we're trying to do to proactively keep our networks secure. Also defending forward, educating and training our people. Again, the most virulent vulnerabilities come through human beings. That's how so many of our adversaries get into our systems. And securing the electromagnetic spectrum and physical lines, big parts of that. Reactively, so if something does happen and somebody does get into your network, then you have to do network triage, your forensics, locking down your infill and exfil points, all those kinds of things. And then finally, persistently, again, remaining active in the adversary networks, ally and partner networks, just staying persistently engaged, constantly fighting the cyber fight. And why we fight. And this should be my last slide, but I break it down into speed, need, and creed. From a speed perspective, think cognitive, affective. Now the reason I add affective here, so my PhD is in education. I'm very into the 3 domains of learning, which are cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. Psychomotor is the stuff you do, you're operating something, it's really heavy in training. Cognitive is what you think. But in cyberspace and in the information environment, affective is really where it's at. It's how you feel. It's your emotions. It's how you react to things. And I think that in cyberspace and the electromagnetic spectrum is what our adversaries are really trying to leverage against us, far more than what we think. Far more than decision cycles. It's about how can they slow us down by getting inside how we feel about something and how we can be under stress, how we can be, how it can be used against us, essentially. Of course, technological speed of things happening today, constant production of algorithmic tools, and of course, I prefer that term over AI and I've explained why, AI is not really intelligent, it's just following instructions. But quantum capabilities, nanotechnology, something to note here, and I'll be as brief as possible because we are running out of time, is that the algorithmic tools that we're using today, and I'll give you an example. There is a 1.5 billion, 1.3 million square foot meta facility being built on 331 across from the Hyundai plant here in Montgomery, Alabama. Some of you are probably aware of that. That plant will employ 100 people because most of what is done in that huge space is done with robots. That plant is a data facility specifically for running all these algorithmic tools for Meta. That's what it's there for. It will consume massive amounts of water and electricity from the local area. Those are things to be aware of, okay? The reason that all of that is true is because our current computing schemes are based off of binary, ones and zeros. The computer machine language that was discovered by Claude Shannon is what Anthropic's thing is named after. Claude Shannon, he's the father of information theory. He discovered that the simplest choice you can make in any situation is either a 1 or a 0, a yes or a no, on, off, And Alan Turing took that and applied it to transistors, where you can turn them on and off, right? And we took it on chips, and it's gone and gone and gone and gone and gone. The only problem is you have Moore's law, so you can only run that so far as how many transistors you can actually fit on a chip. So we have to have lots and lots of chips and lots of machines to do lots and lots of processing to be able to do these huge algorithmic things that we're doing today. Now, if you were to take, and this is, I believe, coming probably faster than we think, a quantum computer, which processes things probabilistically, not linearly, like a traditional computer does, you can do a lot of those same functions with a lot less power, a lot faster. And I'll give you an example, quick, easy example. 1 billion mazes, 1 billion pieces of cheese, and 1 billion mice. A classical computer, even the most high-speed, multi-threaded computer that you have today, it's going to take it 10,000 years, because what it's going to do is it's going to solve one maze, then it's going to move on to the next one. It's going to solve that one. Then it's going to move to the next one. It's going to take it a long time, because it's doing linear computing, ones and zeros, yes or no, all the way down. Quantum computers operate differently. They use these things called qubits. There are subatomic particles that have been brought close to each other, and they take on each other's properties, and that forms this thing called a qubit. It's a pairing of these two subatomic particles, usually photons, light particles. And when that happens, they become entangled, which puts them in the state of something called superposition. And you can take these things and separate them by miles and change this one over here, and this one instantaneously changes as well. And they can be a 1 and a 0 at the same time. They can be any value between 1 and 0 simultaneously, which offers you the ability to essentially do what's called probabilistic computing, which means that when that quantum computer looks at 1 billion mazes and 1 billion pieces of cheese and 1 billion mice, it can probabilistically factor all of them in a matter of minutes versus 10,000 years. And it can use far less energy. Now, current quantum computers will fill up a fairly large room because they have, they have to be super cooled. There is an organization called D-Wave, which recently has used lasers to stabilize qubits at room temperature, which is a revolution, which they have essentially been able to build a 50 qubit quantum computer. They plan by, I think, 2030 to have a 1,000 qubit quantum computer that is stable at room temperature, which can also be miniaturized potentially in the future, and that's where nanotechnology comes in. Until you can get to things like microreactors, honeycomb graphene lattices, things that are superconductive type nanotechnology like that, then you get to quantum computing at scale, where it's small enough you can actually put it in a desk computer, something of that sort. So we're going that direction. If you look at D-Wave and the stocks right now, it's going up, and it's because they're coming up with things like this. But just wanted you to be aware of the speed aspect of this and where we're going with it and what the possibilities are, maybe even sooner than we ever imagined because of the high speed toward that. Data is growing all the time. The attack surface is proliferating all the time. We are, I often say, how do you protect a military base that's the size of the Earth and all the space around it? You can't, but that's what cyberspace and the electromagnetic spectrum essentially is. So many ways into it, so much attack surface there. Being aware of that need to secure everything and anything and everything we can. And our adversary is constantly seeking information and trying to deny, destroy, do anything they can, manipulate us in different ways. And then create, of course, support and defend, defending critical infrastructure and key resources, and being there for our allies and partners. So I'm going to end there. I'm sorry I went a little over time by a couple of minutes. My fault. Thank you for your time and your attention. Hope this is helpful, helps you in the class today. And if you have any questions, you can get with me through email or on Teams. So thank you.